Hello and welcome to It's Your Business with Mario Toneguzzi on Megapix Media. Joining me today is Mark Milke, who is Executive Director of Research for the Canadian Energy Centre here in Calgary. Thanks for joining us today, Mark.
You bet, Mario. Thanks for having me.
Well, you folks put out a fact sheet today on the oil patch, looking at the economy and jobs. Can you tell me some of the key findings, the key numbers that come out of that fact sheet today?
Sure, you bet. So using Statistics Canada data and what that statistical agency does is estimate the impact, the direct impact, the indirect impact of the oil and gas sector. We asked them to do some number crunching for us, and they did. And then we did some further number crunching, trying to simplify it and put it all together. But basically what we found is if you look back to the most recent year that they have this kind of data available for, 2016, and most of your listeners will know that was after 2 years of decline in oil and gas prices. Even then, direct employment in the sector was over 220,000. And they figure there is an indirect impact of the oil and gas sector in Canada. So this is countrywide of over 380,000 jobs. So that's pretty impressive. I mean, you add the two figures together and they're over 3% of jobs in the country. And so to give you an example, we dug down into various sectors across the country and said, all right, what's the oil and gas impact? And again, StatsCan gave us the numbers on this. If you look at something like, think about architecture, right, and engineering. We know that oil and gas in Canada has been a pretty capital-intensive industry. So you're building factories, you're building, you're putting up plants in the oil sands, for example, and related. You're using money to fund related expansion of existing facilities. Well, you need architects for that. You need engineers. And the number of jobs that architects and engineers have because of the oil sands, or not the oil sands, oil and gas, including the oil sands in Canada, is about 30,000 jobs. So that's pretty high. Those are the indirect jobs, direct and indirect jobs. So, and that's across Canada. So what we tried to do with this particular fact sheet is talk to the rest of Canada. I mean, most Albertans know the value of oil and gas and the kind of employment impact it's had in Alberta. But I doubt most Canadians necessarily understand the impact that this sector has had on their industries, right, in British Columbia or Quebec or Ontario. So that's what we tried to do with this particular fact sheet released today.
Now, what about in terms of pure kind of GDP numbers? What can you tell me about the oil patch and its share, I guess, there in the overall economy?
Sure. So there are a number of ways to measure impact on GDP, and a narrow definition is the best way to put it. I'm simplifying somewhat. The direct oil and gas extraction sector is worth about 2.2% of GDP in the country. But when you use the expanded, the broad energy sector's contribution to GDP, direct and indirect, you're up at over 5%, so 5.4% of Canada's total GDP. It's one of the largest sectors in the country because of that. So it's pretty, it's pretty significant. And I mean, it's worth, for example, depending on the measurement again, you look at strict GDP, a narrow measurement, you're talking about $100 billion in 2016. You use this direct and indirect impact analysis from Statistics Canada, and you're looking at $210 billion in impact. So a way to quantify that or to bring it down to earth is, I mean, think about, again, you hire an architectural firm in, I don't know, Saskatoon to do some work in oil and gas. They might contract with a finance office out of Toronto, which is another sector we looked at, for example. If you're sitting around crunching numbers and trying to figure out where to invest money in Toronto, then a Toronto finance office, where, the financial heart of the country, there are a lot of jobs that are reliant on oil and gas investment historically as well in Toronto. So you've got a company in Saskatoon that employs an engineer or multiple engineers. You've got others that will employ architects, and you've got maybe the same company looking for finance out of Ontario, out of Toronto. This is kind of how you get the indirect impact on other sectors over and above just direct impact. Again, someone in or some company in Alberta investing directly in, say, an oil and gas well, or more likely the oil sands these days, or natural gas in British Columbia, for example. So the indirect impacts are pretty significant right across the country.
So when you look at, obviously these numbers are from a couple of years ago. If we fast forward to today, like how much of a change do you think those numbers would have?
Well, it's a bit speculative because, again, unfortunately, these are very specialized numbers that Statistics Canada puts together. But you don't have the numbers until you have the numbers, right? So you're kind of guessing. I mean, Statistics Canada did come out with an analysis last week that showed the disappearance of, I think it was over 40,000 jobs in the energy sector in the past several months. So that's pretty horrific. They're not necessarily the same jobs. You won't have the exact same numbers when you include direct and indirect, but those numbers are not available for several years. It's just the way the National Statistical Agency works, right? And you have to wait for the numbers to come in, and you have to crunch them and come up with your estimates, which they do. And then again, we further refine them in terms of making them more accessible, if I can put it that way. So for example, even across the country, there are 12,000 people directly or indirectly affected by oil and gas, the oil and gas sector, in computer services, right? Literally, when you think about companies buying computers, they're probably not made in Alberta. You might be buying them from a supplier in Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal. You might be in a small office, or you might be in a chain store somewhere like that. Banking, the sector is responsible for direct and indirect employment of 11,000 people in the banking sector, the financial sector across the country. And again, a lot of those would be concentrated, I would imagine, in downtown Toronto, among other places across the country, and to a lesser degree, or a pretty significant degree as well, in Calgary, I'm guessing. So those are the kind of direct and indirect impacts that the fact sheet from the Canadian Energy Centre looks at. And again, with an eye to saying to the rest of the country, you may not be aware, but this is the impact the sector has on you.
The other question I had, Mark, is obviously, traditionally the jobs in that sector are high-paying jobs. Can you talk a little bit about that and the impact that has when you lose a lot of the high-paying jobs in any industry?
Right. Well, we didn't go into it in this particular fact sheet, but we've done that in past fact sheets from the Canadian Energy Centre, which are available on the website as well. But the oil and gas sector is one of the highest paying sectors in the country, right? It pays more than the automotive sector or the aerospace sector, which are significant employers in their own right in Ontario and Quebec. But the oil and gas sector, regardless of whether it's in Newfoundland and Labrador, right, it exists there, whether it's northern British Columbia, natural gas exploration and extraction, whether it's southern Saskatchewan, or whether it's Alberta, the sector does pay significantly more than other industries in the country. And again, in part because historically, I mean, there was such a great demand for Canadian oil and gas, still is, but at lesser prices, lower prices. But historically, because there was such a great demand, that pushed up wages in a very natural, organic way is the best way to put it. And so we, in Alberta in particular, pushed up wages and it gave a lot of people a very good living. We've also noticed in our past work at the center that Indigenous Canadians are employed to a greater degree in the oil and gas sector, in the energy sector broadly, vis-a-vis automotive, vis-a-vis aerospace. So I haven't looked at that particular fact sheet for a couple of months, but as I recall, I think it's about 8% of employment in the sector is Indigenous, if I recall correctly, and that compares to that's a lot more. I think the automotive sector was I think it was around 5%, for example, if I remember correctly. But that fact sheet is available on our website. So there is a significant amount of benefits that flow to Indigenous Canadians. We have a fact sheet on immigrant Canadians and immigrant Canadians and their employment profiles. So I don't think the rest of the country is necessarily aware of how good this sector has been for a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Then thanks for joining us today, Mark.
You're welcome. Thank you.
That was Mark Milke, who is Executive Director of Research for the Canadian Energy Centre in Calgary. This has been It's Your Business with Mario Toneguzzi on Megapix Media. Thanks for joining us today.